This is Macro Analytics, delivering frank conversations on global macroeconomics and market analysis, outside the mainstream, featuring discussions and debates between Gordon T. Long, publisher and editor of GordonTLong.com, and his guests. The content of this discussion is strictly the opinion of the participants. It is in no way a solicitation for business, nor is it to be considered investment advice of any sort. Always consult a registered investment advisor before making any investment decision. These discussions are extremely hard-hitting and terribly frank, and parental discretion is advised. Now, on to the show.
Good morning. I'm Gord Long with GordonTLong.com, and I have with me a new guest here this morning, Michael Snyder. Michael is a prolific writer on the web and is the publisher of the website The Economic Collapse. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you for having me on the show. It's really great to be with you.
Michael, I wonder if you could give our listeners a perspective on your background in writing.
Sure. Before I was doing any of this writing, I was actually working as an attorney right in the heart of Washington, D.C. I'm a graduate of the University of Florida Law School, where I got a JD and then an LLM. And then I moved up to D.C., worked as an attorney, low-level attorney, but I worked for a couple of the largest law firms actually in D.C., right in the heart of D.C. My last job was right on K Street. So I was kind of in the belly of the beast, if you will. You know, as I was working down there, I didn't feel like I was making much of a difference. And then I was becoming increasingly frustrated by what I saw going on around me with our economy, in our political system. And so I thought, well, what in the world can I do to make a difference? So I started writing. I started doing a bit of blogging. And at first, very few people took notice, as with any new website or blog. But over time, I started to build an audience, and then I started the Economic Collapse blog, and that really struck a chord because, we were coming out of the Great Recession, and millions of people had lost their jobs, millions of people had lost their homes, people were hurting, and a lot of people knew that they weren't getting the truth about what was going on from the mainstream media. They had a lot of questions, but they weren't getting a lot of answers. And so what I tried to do with my site is not just tell people what I think, but also have all kinds of facts and lists and charts and graphs, in essence, kind of laying out the evidence and explaining to people on a level that the average person on the street can understand what's going on. And like I said, it's really struck a chord, and over time, it's built into a very, very large audience. And I feel very blessed to be able to do this because I enjoy writing. I enjoy doing these articles. And then I hear from people all over the world that enjoy my writing and it's helpful to them. And I'm very honored by that.
You said the word evidence, and that's what really, to me, comes out in so many of your works. It's the facts, and you lay them out more often than not in list form. They're indisputable, the bibliography in terms of where the sources are there, and when you read the list of the facts, it's pretty easy to start drawing conclusions, and you certainly express your conclusions and your observations, but they're well-founded. I didn't appreciate that you had a law background, and I won't hold up Washington. That also gives you even a better perspective overall of the facts, right?
Yeah, and it kind of, the way I write my articles kind of feeds out of my background, because with a legal background, I had a real sense of, okay, if I'm going to say something, I should prove it with evidence. And so I kind of lay out my case with each article. And I felt from the beginning it was so important for people to be able to go see the sources. So I link to the source for each fact. So people say, well, I don't know if that's true. Well, they can go and click on the original source for that fact, whether it's a mainstream news article or if it's, I try when I can to actually click to the official government report or government document or research study where the figure comes from. And so, and I think that kind of sets what I'm doing apart from some of the other people out there who just say, well, I think this is what's happening, but I try to include as much hard data and much hard evidence as I can in my articles.
I asked you to join me today here, Michael, to talk about 4 of your most current articles, and I have a list of them up here now. They were really telling to me in the context of a lot of work that we've been doing, and a lot of listeners will be familiar with one of these charts, this one I have up now called the Globalization Trap. And we'll get into a little bit more because I want to relate these articles to this particular cycle this so clearly here that we are already in a globalization liquidity trap that's building at a rapid rate, and why that's the case. But rather than draw conclusions on that, I wanted to start with these articles, and then we'll position them in that regard. Why did you choose these particular 4 articles before we talk about each one, Michael? What was the motivation?
Every day when I sit down to write, I go and kind of review the news and what's going on. I use current events as inspiration to inspire me to write an article touching on themes that I've been exploring over the course of the past few years, kind of dominant themes of what's happening in the economy and why, but I'll relate whether it's a new study, a new piece of information, something that's happening with government, whatever it is, and tie it into a greater theme that I've been exploring over a period of time.
Well, that leads actually to the very first article that I wanted to talk about, and this was the one on robotics and computers taking half of the jobs, at least within the next 20 years. And I've seen many, many articles on this, of this whole nature of creative destruction. It's almost a productivity paradox that we're facing, where the faster technology goes, the less jobs that are needed or they're automated, which reduces the number of people required. Here in Boston, we used to have DEC with 300,000, Wang with 150,000, Data General. I could go on. They're all gone. And instead, what's been replaced, we're still a technology center. We have all the biotech companies here. But they only employed 3,000 people or 4,000 people. So where did the hundreds of thousands of people go? Where they went? Where are the jobs? Could you highlight the article to some of the listeners that may not have read it?
Yeah. And I kind of want to go back and, because a lot of people, they think of how the U.S. economy was back in the 70s or 80s or 90s. But what people need to realize is we're witnessing fundamental economic transformation today. And for average American workers, it's translating into a loss of jobs. And as with technology, as I'll get into here in a moment, but also, we've seen over the past decade especially, millions of jobs and tens of thousands of businesses leaving this country, going to the other side of the globe. In fact, since 2001, we've seen more than 56,000 manufacturing facilities permanently shut down in the United States, most of them going to places like China and other places where labor is cheaper, because big corporations, they're sitting back and they're saying, well, why should I pay an American worker 10 or 20 times as much as I could pay someone on the other side of the world, or that I can pay them $1 or $2 an hour? I don't have to provide health care or other benefits, and I can make a lot more money. So we've seen that happening big time. But now that trend is almost being superseded by this trend of replacing labor with technology. And so we're starting to see all over the world companies, as much as they possibly can, that using computers and robots and other forms of technology to replace workers. In fact, this is even happening in China now. One of the biggest manufacturing companies over there, Foxconn, is actually they're transitioning a lot of their labor force over to robotics, because what's happening with this technology, we're seeing the cost of technology go down as it's becoming more advanced and more efficient. And so what that means is that the labor that can be done by technology is becoming cheaper and more efficient compared to the labor that we can do, average American workers. And so in this article, I discussed a brand new study that's just come out that was authored by 2 professors at Oxford University. And what they found was that 47% of all U.S. jobs could be automated within the next 20 years. So we're talking within the next 2 decades, the possibility of a labor displacement that is absolutely unprecedented. Now, people will point out, well, in the past, when there was the Industrial Revolution, when there was technology, well, that created new types of jobs for people to do, and it was good for workers in a lot of ways. But, we're rapidly getting to the point when, what happens when robots and computers and technology are better at everything, when there's really very few things that humans are more efficient or can do more cheaply than technology can. Where does that leave us?
It leaves us with 200 million unemployed people right now, and the World Bank talking about the billions of new jobs that are going to have to be created over the next decade as this problem accelerates. And I refer to it as the productivity paradox. And as good as technology is and it endorses, it's creating a problem that we haven't thought through on a global basis of where these jobs are going to come from. And, we used to have agricultural kind of work. It's all totally automated. We used to have secretaries and clerical people. They're all gone. We could go on all day. But, Michael, earlier in my career, I was involved very heavily in manufacturing and operations and was in the forefront of really moving a lot of stuff offshore. But I can tell you, even 25 years ago, labor was getting to be a smaller and smaller component of any product. And as you took that labor cost down in automation, it changes everything. And so you've seen this mass movement to China, but it's also moving out of China now as it's moved into Thailand, etc. And they're facing problems as more and more people try and enter the middle class, but there's no work or insufficient work against disposable income to support any kind of standard of living. And therein lies the problem, and it's called the labor arbitrage that's been going on around the world. A very serious problem that, Michael, I see very few people writing about, and it really came through in your article. I complimented you on it. The second article you had was something that I think brought it home to a lot of Americans here on 20 Ordinary Americans, and the feedback you got. I think they wrote to you.
Yeah, this other article I did about that's entitled 20 Ordinary Americans Talk About the Economic Despair That Is Growing Like a Cancer All Around Them. I kind of discussed the two Americas that we're seeing right now. One America, the America that's centered on Wall Street and in Washington, D.C., and the prosperous areas of Silicon Valley out in California, et cetera. That America is doing fine. That America is doing pretty good at the moment. But there's another America, small towns and formerly great manufacturing cities all across this country, where there's a tremendous amount of economic despair, which has actually been growing. People are hurting, and in many communities across the country, there's just not any jobs, or the only jobs that are available are part-time jobs, cutting hair or flipping burgers or stocking store shelves. And that's all that's available.
They've got jobs, but they're part-time jobs. There's insufficient real disposable income for people to live on these jobs that are sort of being created. Or you're needing 2 jobs or 3 jobs. And that is just absolutely crushing America. We become, a country, instead of high-level professional jobs or at a sufficient quantity, they're still there, but enough of them, that we can't support a middle class anymore. We've gutted our middle class.
Oh, we absolutely have. And in one of my recent articles, I noted that according to the U.S. Census, median household income, once adjusted for inflation, has fallen for 5 years in a row. So people are being squeezed. The middle class families, their budgets are getting tighter and tighter and tighter. People are working harder for less. And as you mentioned, the only jobs that seem to be available, in fact, the vast majority of the jobs that have been created this year in the U.S. economy have been part-time jobs.
Yes, exactly.
And in America today, the number 1 employer is Walmart. The number 2 employer is actually a temp agency. Kelly Services is actually the second largest employer in America now. These are the kind of jobs that are being created, but they're not middle class jobs. So the middle class is shrinking. It's being systematically destroyed. And this is a theme that I repeatedly come back to in my writing, because it's for average Americans. It's absolutely imperative that people understand this.
What it also means, not just individuals, is if you don't have people that are working and making a decent income, they're not spending. And therefore, there's not new businesses being created to feed off that income. Henry Ford said when he was making the Ford, he wanted to pay his employers a higher wages so they could afford the cars. And it was the beginnings of the middle class. Well, when that starts to contract, and it's clearly contracting, you have businesses that fail. You have businesses that have to squeeze and go other places. Investment eventually and slowly dries up or finds other kinds of homes. And that's what we're in. And then what happens to Michael, is governments no longer have the money in terms of taxes and fees and registrations, etc., that drive their ability to pay for the infrastructure, to pay for the services that we've come to expect, and it goes into a total contraction. Make sense?
Oh, without a doubt. And so how are they making up the difference? Well, they're making up the difference with debt. And so we're living in this greatest debt bubble in the history of the world. If you go back 40 years ago, the total amount of debt in our system, totaling up all government debt, all business debt, all consumer debt, the total ball of wax 40 years ago was about $2 trillion. Today, we've crossed the $56 trillion mark. So over the past 40 years, the total amount the total amount of debt in our system has gotten more than 28 times larger. So it's just an incredible, almost unbelievable amount of debt. But that's how we've been bridging this gap. As we've seen our economic infrastructure get destroyed. We've been consuming more wealth than we've been producing. This economic decline has been masked in many ways by this awesome amount of debt, which there's going to be a day of reckoning coming for that. I believe we're rapidly approaching, but we've been living on borrowed time.
We've been living on borrowed time for close to 40 years. And I say that, Michael, that since we went off the gold standard in 1971 and moved to a fiat currency, which allowed us to expand money and credit at a dramatic and ever accelerating rate. And there was a reason we had to leave the gold standard. I'm not trying to propose a gold standard. I'm just simply saying it creates the discipline of only spending within your means and producing more than you consume. And when easy credit starts to bring in malinvestment and mispricing. So we've been living this false dream, and it's got accelerated and accelerated. And now I would say that we're at the point of debt saturation, where the growth and the wealth effect no longer can actually carry the amount of interest and money payable on the debt, or that the debt itself is not of solid credit capability or collateral, and so it's starting to implode, whether in non-performing loans or whether the assets themselves are insufficient or become impaired. We're seeing that in the United States, but not as much as we're seeing it around the world. That leads to the third article, where you talk the Cyprus-style wealth confiscation that we're now starting to see, where other countries are a little even further along in terms of the problems that they're facing. And I think you mentioned even Poland in this as an example.
Oh, I did. And, when the wealth confiscation happened in Cyprus, a lot of people in the mainstream media were saying, oh, this is only a one-time event. Don't worry. It's not a big deal. But what they did is they set a precedent. And they saw, okay, are people going to react against this? Are they going to get upset? Can we get away with this? And they did get away with it. And so now what's happened is all over the world, people are looking at what happened in Cyprus and saying, okay, we're going to use this in the future. And, we're starting to see examples of different forms of wealth confiscation. You mentioned Poland. What just happened in Poland was reported in Reuters that the Polish government essentially went and did this giant grab of private pension funds and, essentially nationalized them. But it was just essentially, what they did is they took a massive amount of private assets away from the general public without offering any compensation. And of course, the Polish government is trying to make all of it sound legal and justifiable, and they're trying to put a pretty bow on it. But really what it is wealth confiscation. And then, we're seeing move toward this in other places as well. Over in Europe, the European finance ministers recently got together and said, okay, for future bank bailouts, what we're going to do is we're going to implement a regime of bank bail-ins and make that the standard procedure for all future major bank failures in Europe. And in fact, we're already starting to see this in Italy. A bail-in is now being organized for the oldest bank in Italy. Now, they're not going to go after private bank accounts just yet. Right now, it looks like they're only going after the bondholders, but they're using a similar template to what we saw in Cyprus. So from now on, whenever there's a major bank failure in Europe, those who have private bank accounts have got to be afraid. Now, maybe they'll only have to go after the bondholders or whatever, and they might not get to those who hold private bank accounts. But this is the template that's being used now over in Europe. And we've also seen similar things be proposed in New Zealand, in Canada. Now, it hasn't been proposed in the United States yet, but this is starting to become the norm all over the world. And I believe eventually we'll see a similar thing in the United States as well.
They're already talking about pensions in various forms and changes, but this pension grab is a very standard procedure as part of something called financial repression, as governments, it's a macroprudential policy to be able to shore up the credit of countries that where they'll never become truly insolvent, but because they can print their money, but in fact as they find themselves caught in this trap. And you've seen Argentina, you've seen Venezuela, you've seen countries like this already do this, a very standard kind of practice. And in the United States, the form will likely take where you won't be taken from you, you will be put into the government account and you'll be issued bonds by U.S. government bonds. But what are those bonds going to be worth, and what is the surrender value, and what will they trade at? Because they're no longer risk-free, which is another problem. But there's a pattern here that you're seeing the countries that simply no longer can afford to continue running in the fashion they were, and the kinds of policies that they're having to adopt that we've never heard of before, we've never seen. They're almost becoming predatory, like they're caught twixt in between. You wrote a fourth article, and you talked about the Weimar Republic, and I thought, this is a good example because Germany was facing incredible debt, monumental debt problems associated with their payments from the First World War, which they were having problems meeting. The economy was stagnated. We had this tremendous amount of printing of money resulted in hyperinflation. You write about it. Could you talk that article?
Sure. And I think there's so many parallels between the two situations where, as you mentioned, there's this tremendous amount of debt and there's the desire to get the economy moving. And whenever you've got the fiat currency, those in charge of the system, there's always the temptation that, if people just had a little bit more money, they would go to the stores and spend, and we could get things moving, and economic activity would increase, and everything would be better. But once you start going down that road, it's easy to become an addict. And once you become an addict, not only can't you stop, but you continually need just a little bit more to get the same kind of effect, the same kind of a buzz.
Easy money and easy credit is the easiest thing to begin. It's almost impossible to get off, and there's actually been no country in the world that's ever survived it. When you lose sound money, you would really lose your ability as a democracy to continue to operate. That's very harsh, but there's never been anybody that's survived it. They end up always resorting to debasement of the currency, right from the Roman times. And that's the road that we're clearly on.
We are breaking this session at this point, and will continue on the next tape number 2. We have a very large audio and iTunes listener base who have requested that the sessions be kept to approximately 20 minutes in duration. We'll be right back.
This has been Gordon T. Long, editor and publisher of GordonTLong.com. New recordings are posted regularly and can be found at GordonTLong.com. New show notifications are available through RSS feed, iTunes, and other social networking venues at GordonTLong.com.